morning, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. As a former infantryman of the Vietnam War era, I'm honoured to be asked to address you as dawn breaks 103 years after the Anzacs landed at Gallipoli. I shall attempt in a humble way to create for you a feeling of what it was like at Gallipoli during the landing and the terrible first day ashore, where 860 Anzacs died that day or died of wounds shortly after. A now little known war correspondent, one Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, writing for the UK's Daily Telegraph, is my source. First-hand description. He wrote the first published reports on the landing at Gallipoli. Remember now, he was a POM writing for the POMs. He had joined the Anzac troops on the ships at the island of Lemnos some 10 to 12 days before the landings, and he closely observed them. His report, dispatched on the 19th of April, at 6 days before the landings, said of the Anzacs, and I quote, "I do not suppose that any country in its palmiest days ever sent forth to the field of battle a finer body of men than these Australians, New Zealanders, and wait for it, and Tasmanians. Physically, they are the finest lot of men I have ever seen in any part of the world. In fact, I had no idea that such a race of giants existed in the 20th century. Some of their battalions averaged 5 feet 10, and every man seems to be a trained athlete." End of quote. Elsewhere in his diary he records, "We have nothing like them in our army," the UK army, "except perhaps some of the picked guards battalions." His published dispatches from the 26th of April record, and I'll give you a chronology now, that at 1:20 a.m. the boats were lowered for landing, and at 2:05 a.m. the first Anzacs were embarked. I quote, "And this was carried out with great rapidity, in absolute silence, and without a hitch or accident of any kind." He then reports in detail the approach to within 2,500 yards of the shore, in darkness and silence, of the League 3 battleships towing our Anzacs, until 4:10 a.m. when they were cast off to proceed alone to the landing points. So far, so good. My own observation as an old soldier. And now to his verbatim published dispatch of the landings and the subsequent hours. Try now to put yourself into the minds of our leading young Anzacs in their tiny boats, and then first ashore 103 years ago, around this hour. I shall read you Ashmead Bartlett's account. "The progress of the boats was indeed slow, and dawn was rapidly breaking, so that at one time it did appear as if they would never land covered by the darkness. Something definite did happen. Exactly at 4:50 a.m. the enemy suddenly showed an alarm light, which flashed for 10 minutes and then disappeared. The next 3 minutes after its appearance passed in breathless anxiety. We could just discern the dull outline of the boats which appeared almost on the beach. Just previously to this, 7 destroyers, conveying other men of the brigade, glided noiselessly through the intervals between the battleships and followed the boats ashore. At 4:53 a.m, there suddenly came a very sharp burst of rifle fire from the beach, and we knew our men were at grips with the enemy. I believe the sound came as a relief to the majority, as the suspense of this prolonged waiting had become intolerable. This fire lasted only for a few minutes and then was drowned out by a faint cheer wafted to us over the waters. How comforting and inspiring was the sound at such a moment. It seemed like a message sent to tell us that the first position had been won and a firm hold obtained on the beach. At 5:03 a.m. the fire intensified, and we could tell from the sound that our men were firing. It lasted until 5:28 and then died down somewhat. No one on board knew exactly what was happening, although the dawn was gradually breaking, because we were looking due east into the sun slowly rising behind the hills, which are almost flush with the foreshore, and there was also a haze. Astern at 5:26 we saw the outline of some of the transports gradually growing bigger and bigger as they approached the coast. They were bringing up the remainder of the Australians and New Zealand division. The first authentic news we received came with the return of some of our boats. A steam pinnace came alongside with two lying forms on her deck and a small figure, pale but cheerful and waving his arms astern. They were one of our midshipmen, just 16 years of age, shot through the stomach, but regarding his injury more as a fitting consummation to a glorious holiday ashore than a wound, and also a chief stoker and petty officer, all three wounded by that first burst of musketry, which caused many casualties in the boats just as they reached the beach. From them we learnt what had happened in those first wild moments. All the tows had almost reached the beach when a party of Turks, entrenched almost on the shore, opened up a terrible fusillade from rifles and also from a Maxim, that's a machine gun. Fortunately, most of the bullets went high, but nevertheless many men were hit as they sat huddled together, 40 and 50 in a boat. This last section is called a trying moment. It was a trying moment, but the Australian volunteers rose as a man to the occasion. They waited neither for orders nor for the boats to reach the beach, but springing out into the sea, they waded ashore and, forming some sort of rough line, rushed straight on the flashes of the enemy's rifles. Their magazines were not even charged, so they just went in with cold steel. And I believe I am right in saying that the first Ottoman Turk since the last crusade received an Anglo-Saxon bayonet in him at 5 minutes after 5 on April the 25th. You might check your watches. It was over in a minute. The Turks in this first trench were bayoneted or ran away, and a Maxim gun was captured. Then the Australians found themselves facing, and this is the horror stuff, some of you have read of it, found themselves facing an almost perpendicular cliff of loose sandstone covered with thick shrubbery, and somewhere halfway up the enemy had a second trench, strongly held, from which they poured a terrible fire on the troops below and the boats pulling back to the destroyers to bring in the second landing party. Here was a tough proposition to tackle in the darkness, but these colonials are practical above all else, and they went about it in a practical way. They stopped a few moments to pull themselves together to get rid of their packs, which no troops should carry in an attack, and then they charged their magazines. Then this race of athletes proceeded to scale the cliffs without responding to the enemy's fire. They lost some men, but did not worry, and in less than a quarter of an hour, the Turks were out of their second position, either bayoneted or in full flight. That's as close as I can get to what really happened 103 years ago, and perhaps plus 20 minutes. Ponder that just for a second. Ladies and gentlemen, young people, I've tried to recreate the history of the early morning, 25 April 1915 for you. Let us remember now the 860 odd young Anzacs who died that day or soon after from their wounds. as well as the 8,700 young Anzacs in total who were killed at Gallipoli over the next 10 months. Their memory, their bravery, and their sacrifice lives within our hearts. Thank you.